Unit 4, Respiratory. The respiratory system is responsible for oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange in the lungs. There are several disease processes and illnesses which affect this system. We will do a brief review of normal respiratory anatomy and physiology. Drug classes which are used to treat disease processes and illnesses of the respiratory system, along with applicable laboratory tests and patient education, will be discussed. These are your objectives. These are your reading assignments. So assignments, you have to review your pulmonary anatomy and physiology as needed, and then read these chapters from your textbooks. You don't have to read everything page by page, but if you want additional information, feel free to visit these chapters in your textbooks. For the most part, you should have most, if not all, of your information in your outlines in combination to your lectures. Anatomy and physiology review. So we're going to be reviewing the pulmonary structures. The main function of the pulmonary system or respiratory system is to deliver oxygen to and remove carbon dioxide from the cells of the body. The respiratory system is divided into the upper respiratory tract, and the lower respiratory tract. So this is an image of the upper respiratory tract. So it includes the nose, the nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx, and larynx, as you can see here. So this is the upper respiratory tract. The main function of the upper respiratory tract is filtering, warming, and humidifying the air. So it's in the upper respiratory tract wherein the air moves into the lung through inhalation, and then also this is where exhalation takes place at the end. So when carbon dioxide moves out of the body via the upper respiratory tract. The lower respiratory tract, it's basically almost entirely within the thorax or chest cavity. So it comprises of the trachea, all segments of the bronchial tree, and the lungs. You can see here we have the trachea, you have your superior lobes, middle lobe of the right lung, and inferior. It's also known as the upper lobe and then lower lobe and middle lobe. As you can see, it's showing the bronchial tree and the lungs. So within the lungs, if we magnify the lungs a lot more, we'll be able to see the alveoli. So this is an example or a representation of the alveolar sac. It's part of the lower respiratory tract. And so alveoli is basically where gas exchange, the oxygen and the carbon dioxide, occurs through the semi-permeable membrane of the alveoli. When talking about the lower respiratory tract, we're also going to talk about the surfactant, and you're going to be able to hear this a lot as you get more experience, and also in this class as well as your other classes when talking about the respiratory system. So surfactant is a mix of lipids and proteins which is secreted by the cells of the alveoli. What it does is it reduces the surface tension and helps to make the alveoli more stable, which prevents them from collapsing. So this is the liquid film. So this is called the surfactant. As you can see in this image over here, the alveolar sac is very vascular. When it comes to its blood supplies, the outer surface of the alveoli is covered in pulmonary capillaries. What happens here is that O2 delivered to the cells by the blood vessels of the circulatory system, and as well as the O2 transferred to hemoglobin protein molecules contained with the RBC system. So that's what's contained in the capillaries. Under C, chest wall. So chest wall, so this area over here, it refers to the structures surrounding and protecting your lungs, mainly the ribs and sternum. Physiology of respiration overview. So first, let's talk about compliance. Compliance is the distensibility or the ability of the lungs to stretch. So it is dependent upon the lung tissue and the rib cage. Next would be ventilation. So ventilation is the air movement in and out of the lungs. So the gas movement in and out of the lungs. So this is basically your inspiration and expiration. So this is the exchange of air between the lungs and the atmosphere so that oxygen can be exchanged for CO2 in the alveoli. Diffusion. Diffusion is the net movement of molecules from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So CO2 moves from the blood to the alveoli where it can be exhaled by the lungs. It moves via diffusion. Acid-base balance or oxygenation. So the respiratory tract can adjust the blood pH, basically exchanging CO2. So depending on the amount of CO2, the pH will change. So for the most part, the higher the CO2, the lower the pH. So that makes it more acidic. And vice versa, the lower the CO2, the higher the pH, and makes it more basic. So what controls respiration? So we have chemoreceptors and mechanical receptors. So the chemoreceptors are located in the brain, aortic arch, and the carotid arteries. It responds to changes in the amount of O2, CO2, and hydrogen ions in the arterial blood. The increase of CO2 or drop in pH stimulates the respiratory centers in the brain and makes us increase our respiratory rate. So again, when it senses an increase in CO2, then the brain says, hey, we need to increase the respiratory rate so we can get rid of that CO2 and basically create a better pH balance. When it comes to the mechanical receptors, so this detects mechanical forces, movement, tension, or pressure in the physiological processes that affects the respiratory rate and the surfactant production. The nervous system influences the pulmonary smooth muscle. So the sympathetic stimulation or adrenergic, it has to do with the epinephrine and norepinephrine, which act as a neurotransmitter, and it causes the fight or flight response. So what happens here is that it can cause a smooth muscle relaxation, bronchodilation, and increase in respiratory rate and depth. On the other hand, we have the parasympathetic stimulation or cholinergic, which mainly it's the acetylcholine that acts as a neurotransmitter, and this causes the rest and digest. So what happens here is that the smooth muscle contracts, it causes bronchoconstriction, and it decreases the respiratory rate and depth. So they're quite the opposite, right? Another thing that we want to go over is the mediators of inflammation. Basically, it's the immune response, so it's derived from the injured tissue, cells, or leukocytes recruited to the site of inflammation. Bradykinin, it's a peptide that causes blood vessels to dilate. We also have the complement. Complement, on the other hand, promotes inflammation. It enhances the ability of antibodies and phagocytic cells to clear microbes and damaged cells. Then we have prostaglandin, which causes the increase in blood flow in the site of injury. Leukotrienes are synthesized in the leukocytes or WBCs. So they're responsible for tightening airway muscles, and they also cause the production of mucus and fluid. Histamine is released after the injury or a lot of times allergic reaction as part of the immune response. It is the mediator of itching. So depending on what system or what we're talking about, histamine has different effects. So on the skin, it does cause some itching, but when it comes to the respiratory system, it does cause some contraction of the respiratory airway, and it also causes blood vessels to dilate, and in the GI system, it does affect the gastric acid secretion. So mast cells, this is a type of WBC or white blood cell, releases leukotrienes and histamine, then triggers mucosal swelling and bronchoconstriction. Our respiratory system also has some defense mechanism. So we have the cough and reflex bronchoconstriction. So this is often induced by mechanical and chemical stimuli in the respiratory tract. As you may notice, food accidentally goes to the wrong pipe, then you start coughing. So this is what happens with the cough and reflex bronchoconstriction. The respiratory system also has filtration and mucociliary response. So this is a self-clearing mechanism of the bronchi. So cilia is a tiny hair-like structure that's found in the nasal passageway, trachea, which sweeps hair, mucus, trap, dust, and basically any foreign object or anything that doesn't belong there to the throat where it can be swallowed. You also have the alveolar macrophages, primarily phagocytes of the innate immune system. So this clears the air spaces from infection, toxins, and allergic particles or allergen that have invaded the mechanical defense of the respiratory tract. Basically, if for some reason the cough and reflex bronchoconstriction did not clear all those foreign substances, then this mechanism takes place. It helps clear the nasal passages, the glottis, and the mucociliary transport system. The gerontological changes in the respiratory system. So as we know, as people age, our anatomy and physiology changes as well. So what happens to the structure and respiratory control? So a lot of the times, the cartilage that connects the ribs to the sternum and spinal column calcifies, thus decreases the mobility of the rib cage. Respiratory muscles get weaker over time. The anterior and posterior diameter of the chest increases, therefore increasing intrathoracic pressure, and overall the size of the lungs will go down, so it decreases in size. When it comes to defense mechanism, cough and laryngeal reflexes are less effective, the ciliary action decreases, and as we age, there is a higher risk for aspiration and infection.